When I take my last breath, I just want to know that in every domain of my life, I swung for the fences and I left every encounter slightly better than it was before I participated in that moment in time. That's with my kid, my siblings, my friends, you, this moment that we're on this podcast. So
Yeah.
when people hear this conversation, I hope that they see what you're really saying. How is it that we can start to be in the reality of where our world is without making it rosy and also not making it doomed?
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com.
A new moment in wireless has begun. T-Mobile and Sprint are joining forces. Bringing together our two networks, T-Mobile will build America's largest and most reliable 5G network. With more towers, more engineers, more bandwidth, and more coverage, you'll not only get the best 5G network in America, you'll also get the best prices. Welcome to T-Mobile.
Nice to meet you.
Sarah, welcome back to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having me. Such an honor.
Yeah, it is my pleasure to have you back. You know, you and I spoke early in the year where we talked about this idea of how to change your life without losing your mind. And the funny thing is that, I think a continuation of that conversation is incredibly fitting given the particular moment that we're at in history. But before we get to that, I want to start by asking you, what did your parents do for work and how did that end up influencing and shaping the choices that you ended up making with your life?
I love this question so much. This really might be one of your best questions ever, and that's a high bar. Okay. My dad was a really successful restaurateur. He owned a bunch of restaurants in Boston, and he had sort of a unique and interesting upbringing himself. And my mom was a first grade teacher for a year. And then at 23 or 24, she started having children, and they had 6 of us. Being raised in the restaurant industry essentially shaped me probably more than most other things in my life, most other environments I was exposed to. First of all, the restaurant industry is a trade industry, right? You can come in hardworking and not specifically educated for that field, and you can work your way up and really put a life together. And so I was around kind of that kind of environment my whole life: kitchens, restaurants. I worked every part of restaurants and worked really with people from all kind of walks of life. And the people skills it taught me, the capacity to sort of think about multiple things at a time. I have an 11-year-old for sure, even though I made a really conscious decision not to be in the restaurant business. I'll for sure require that my kid spend some time in restaurants. It's a really good environment for us to learn about life.
Wow. So many questions come from just that alone.
Yeah.
One is the 6 siblings. That is a massive family. What do you learn about navigating social dynamics and human relationships from growing up in such a big family?
Everything. And I was the caboose. I am the caboose. I'm the youngest. And it's everything. I actually wrote my first self-reflection admissions essay to my master's degree 20 plus years ago on that. And that, it's really, there is no way to even put into words how much it's influenced me, because its tentacles are everywhere.
Yeah.
And it's also just a part of me. I don't know any other life without sort of tons of bodies, tons of opinions. And all my siblings are just these sort of um, really dynamic personalities. So it wasn't like there was like a shy sort of wallflower in the bunch. Um, yeah, it's everything. It's totally everything. And I find myself increasingly, as I mature, falling back on this capacity to really understand group dynamics more and more in my professional life.
Yeah, there's so many questions that come from just that alone, right? So I'm not an only child, and I remember the first time I met my brother-in-law. I remember my sister's like, yeah, he doesn't have any siblings, and in my mind, I was always like, oh, there's the red flag. Like, I'm always, and I think that only children turn out in one of two ways: that they basically treat their friends like siblings, which fortunately my brother-in-law is, that type. And then I've had friends who I don't think that they intentionally are this way, but they're unconsciously incredibly selfish in really small ways because they've never had to cater to anybody else. So, I wonder, what you have to say about that as a psychologist and like as the caboose, as you put it. How do you make sure your voice is heard in that situation? Because I think when you grow up in the families that we did, like in an Indian family, if you're the baby and there's 6 siblings, I can guarantee you your voice is not going to be heard. I mean, we're loud as shit as it is, but in general, your voice is probably not going to be heard. And I guess really the question is, for somebody who feels that their voice is not being heard, how do they make sure that happens?
Yeah, such a good question. And actually, you hit on a really good topic personally, because I actually have a single child. So not only am I a psychologist, but I have a single born child, right? And I totally know what you mean. I see differences, I guess, as a mother and as a shrink, I wouldn't necessarily call it selfishness, although I understand totally as somebody that spent my life in the full contact sport of negotiating with siblings. My whole life was an act of negotiation. And, so I really get how at a deep level it comes across that way. And you're right, there is for sure, like with my kid, definitely like his cousins and his friends really become that sort of sibling dynamic where you are jousting for all that sort of peer-based dominance, power, having a voice. I can see why this question naturally leads to the next one even. But yeah, there is like, he is having, I think he has a great life. He thinks he has a great life, but he has a particular life. And we all come from these particular lives. And his particular life has that he doesn't have to navigate and a sibling dynamic in order to get his way. And that will show up in his adulthood. And I will, with a little bit of luck, I'll get to see that, right? And sort of see like, oh yeah, there that is. So your observation is both accurate and it's also super keen. You can't outrun where you were, the environment that deeply shaped you. And so, and like it's, has positives and it has negatives. So related to the voice thing, I'm 45 years old, and the truth is I'm still looking to find my voice. And I would say my 40s have ushered in, there's a reason why I have never done any of this prior to 5 years ago, because I just clearly wasn't there, right? I had my practice, I did a little bit of writing, but there was a problem with having a voice or something, So sometimes you're just sort of in the process of evolving into it. And some of the skills I learned in having a voice in a big family, they weren't necessarily adaptive to adult partnerships. And I had to do some unlearning, right? Because I was never somebody who was quiet or meek. I always made my needs known. In a big family, you'll just die on the vine if you don't. But I would say if people are looking, first of all, if you really feel that's the intersection you're at, call me. I love that, especially if you're like leading an organization or doing any of the things in the world that I've sort of made a subspecialty, right? I love that chapter where you're really trying to either pivot your voice or find your voice in more earnest. So, work with somebody who does that for a living. But also, I mean, the best practice is just do it. Usually you're going to start to find that, for me, it was fear of judgment, fear of criticism, and of course, the ever present fear of failure. And all those vulnerabilities kept me muted in ways that ultimately didn't serve my best self. I love doing this kind of stuff. And so you have to wrestle with that. And part of the journey of figuring out why you maybe feel internally censored is that journey. And it's awesome to go on.
Yeah. So this is something that I've always wondered out of morbid curiosity, and I don't think I've ever had a psychologist with a family as big as yours to be able to ask this question to. So, the thing that I've always been curious about, and there's a good chance, as I know, since you're a listener, you've heard me ask this question about the impact that age gap has on the bond between siblings. So I wonder, one, what is the age gap of you and your siblings? Which of them are you closest to? And what is, and why is that?
Okay. Great question. Really great question. And there is some research out there, and I can get into that on age gap. I'm no expert in it. So like anybody that's listening, if I've bungled it, I don't yet have a fact checker on my staff. Those are life goals. Okay. So between me and my siblings is 10 years. It goes girl, 3 boys, 2 girls. And there's 10 years between us, like kind of almost to the day with, it's like 10 years and 2 weeks or something. So put it in perspective. When I was 8, my oldest sibling left for college. And so for me, that just was normal and people were sort of coming and going. It also meant that I had a period of time on the back end of my life when everybody had gone to college and I wasn't in college, that I actually got 2 full years of having basically my parents totally to myself for a period of time. That was super interesting. So, I'm one of the fortunate people that just loves all my siblings. I'm crazy nuts about all of them, foibles and all. And I have different relationships with all of them. I've worked really hard in my adult life to just have unique relationships with people, meet them totally where they're at. But I have like a sister right above me. She's 2.5 years older than me, who I'm super close with. And I have a brother who's, in the older mix that I'm really close with. But I mean, I don't even know who I could, I have different bonds with all of them. But yeah, I mean, certainly probably my sister right above me, because like she was, my person. Like she was the person that she was my peer. Okay. And then the research, and I'm remembering this, I'm going in the way, way back machine here. But I think I found, if there's a good fact checker out there, one time on the research about birth order and proximity does impact closeness. Closeness isn't a synonym for love, right? It's just for sort of closeness and, playfulness and all of that. And that also siblings that are closer together, like I have a set of Irish twins in my family. The 2 oldest boys are Irish twins. So they're just a little bit under a year apart. Super close in age has its own dynamic. This is all developmentally mediated by what's going on in the child who's born developmentally at the time that the next child is happening, right? It's all sort of those dynamics get mediated by development and temperament and all those complexities. And then that there's sort of a sweet spot between 2 and 3 years apart. And then if I remember correctly, after 7 years, it almost becomes that the personality styles are more like 2 single borns, right? Because they're They are so different in age. Now, it may be like if you just had a 2-person family, it may be 9 years. I can't remember the specifics.
Wow. So, you mentioned this period of your life where you were the only one left at home. How did that change the dynamic or relationship you had with your parents during that period?
Yeah, and it was an interesting time in my family because it was sort of my parents divorced when I left for college. So it was also sort of a period of time where I see now, when I was in it, I don't know that I had this sort of wisdom, right? But I could see that they were both sort of on the back nine of making this thing work. And, but that was a great time for me in many ways, right? I was finishing high school. I had a great friend group. I was getting ready to go off to college, and we just had time. Like, I just remember things slowing down and like actually having really meaningful conversations with my parents as individuals, and also really starting to get to know them as people. Just sort of as separate from like, they are my parents. It was great. I mean, it was great. It had a backdrop and an undertone, because I never want to seem like I'm sort of painting a picture that's sort of just like not realistic, right? But because people that I know listen to this, right? They're going to be like, you left out a huge factor that was happening. But there was sort of there was a crescendo in those last 2 years. It was the following year when I went off to college, or maybe the year after, that they split up, right? So I do remember also becoming really aware that they weren't a great fit. Like in my own life, as like I was dating at that point, I'm 17, 18, I'm dating, and I'm starting to sort of in my head be like, they are a weird fit. But it was also like awesome. I mean, I really got to know, I remember a couple of trips with them, just the three of us. And it was just really terrific, very special when they both passed away now. So I look back and think, oh, wow, like those are the memories that surface as very relevant.
So we know a lot of you have been listening to us for years, and it means the world to us. What we do here at The Unmistakable Creative wouldn't be possible without the support of our listeners. If the podcast has been valuable to you, one of the best ways you can support us is to subscribe to Unmistakable Creative Prime, which gives you access to transcripts, all of our courses, monthly coaching calls, live chats with our guests, and an incredible community of creatives. And it costs less than you spend on a cup of coffee every month. For the school teachers and people in our education system, Prime is completely free to help you with this transition to teaching online. We've packed it with a ton of value and actionable content, and we hope you'll check it out. Just go to unmistakablecreative.com/prime to learn more. Again, that's unmistakablecreative.com/prime.
Yeah, I mean, I think you answered my question about the sort of impact that that would have, on your adult relationships. But to me, it's mind-boggling because a family of 6, successful, it almost successful restaurateur, like seems like a Brady Bunch on the surface, and it just kind of. I think that this is the quote that comes to mind when I hear you describe that as something that Cheryl Strayed said, that reality is unforgivingly complex, and I took it and I doctored it and I said that family is unforgivingly complex.
Oh, it's and it's beautifully complex, right? All of the bumps and the bruises inside of families are where we really sort of become, that is the battleground on which we become, the young adult that we emerge as in our 20s. And it gives me chicken skin. Yeah, no. And for sure, for me, my family was very well known in the city that I grew up in Boston. And Dad was sort of a larger than life character and had a very interesting upbringing. And, my mom was just like this beautiful, dynamic woman. And so for me, for sure, there was, they were married for 43 years. And when they separated, I remember sort of saying inside of my head, like, oh, wow, that's really interesting. All that time bought them was time. There was no safety. There was no security. There wasn't a guarantee. They just had time. The sort of dismantling of the projections that people had about us, and that I had about us. I'm included in that audience. That was a really pivotal, difficult time. It was a full contact sport for me. I've written about it on my blog. My sort of 20s and early 30s were a real complicated time for me. But God, has it made me a much better woman.
Yeah. Well, I think that, the words safety, security, and guarantee really kind of make a perfect segue to talking about why we wanted to have another conversation about this. And I think that, starting with, your dad being a successful restaurateur is actually the perfect place to begin, given, restaurants themselves are really suffering right now. What were, your earliest lessons about, money, wealth, and economic survival, given that this is the context you grew up in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's like a summit in my life. My dad was like this great big character. And he was really he was the son of, a complex, kind of infamous historical figure in the state of Massachusetts, for sure. And he had all these complexities about money. And he was kind of a guy that, like a lot of restaurateurs are, if he had $20, he was putting 40 on the line. And he did that, he hit a grand slam more times than not. And so we lived a super comfortable life in that way, and he afforded it for us, and my mother as the support team. But there was an underlying sort of volatility to the way he managed things, and it worked well for the restaurant industry. And I have thought routinely during this period of time in our history about how my dad would have pivoted and shown agility. He was just so good at those kinds of things because he was sort of an adrenaline junkie. And so he really liked that feeling that kind of everything was tippy-toppy. That's where he jived best. So, but I mean, probably there's only a handful of industries that will, in the end of this, be impacted the way restaurants will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's all predicated on the opposite of social distancing.
Yeah, no, I see it firsthand where I live in Boulder. I'm kind of saw the, guys who run the restaurant where I was pretty much a regular every Friday. And I saw them last night for the first time in 2 months. They're like, hey, we're opening this Friday. And it was just weird to think one of them said that, he was supposed to actually get his, open a big restaurant on his own this year as part of the restaurant group. And that got kiboshed. And, but, I think he said something to me that really struck me. He said, you know what? He said, I asked him, how are you guys? And he said, I'm alive and well. And yes. I thought, wow, we take that for granted, right? That you're in good health and that you're alive, especially right now. We think, oh, okay, but the thing is, outside of that, I mean, I think that, one thing that I can't help but think as I say that out loud is that there are people who are suffering so much who would be like, you know what, I'd rather be dead because, that would be better than dealing with the crisis that I'm currently dealing with. You and I originally, I think when we attempted to record this the first time, we began, sort of talking about this idea of, managing your mental health in the midst of this. In fact, by the time people are listening to this, you will have done a live conversation with the members of our listener tribe about this. But, I think let's start with money in particular, because I think that really is the source of so much of our suffering right now. I mean, I know this because I've had to ask, family for help at times in the last couple of months. Certain things that I thought were going to kick in haven't yet. How do we navigate that dynamic first? Because I think that if you don't get your head around that, that alone, I mean, we can't, deny reality and say that this isn't important. You've got politicians who are making policy where they have zero skin in the game because they're not affected by the consequences of their actions. You think Steve Mnuchin gives two shits that, he basically probably has to issue these $1,200 checks. But at the same time,
Which I haven't gotten. If they need me to say my address out loud, I'm happy to.
Well, if you're worth $300 million, you're not affected by that policy that you're making.
Right.
So let's start there. I'll tee that up to you.
Yeah. Well, that's a huge topic, right? So I think that this pandemic reveals to us sort of all of our kind of underbellies, right? I know that my financial habits have been revealed to me in ways that wouldn't have happened without the pandemic. And for some of those observations, I'm really grateful because I'll actually implement, like the not going out as much, like just having an awareness of how much I used to sort of go and like spend $20 here at Whole Foods and then like $10 at Starbucks and, just that accumulation. So I think there's an opportunity for us at an individual and a family level to use this space for reflection. I also know that the space of reflection is a place of privilege and that there are people for whom the thought, like they're literally not capable of paying their bills. Those are larger problems that sort of would need an entire podcast with experts to really kind of unpack. So I'm going to kind of stick with, there's the middle of the bell curve, right? On the one end are people worth $300 million, and on the other end are people who are really struggling with basic needs. And in that case, you have a layer of complexity that's different than what maybe we're going to be able to tackle in today's scope, right?
Mm-hmm.
One thing you said during the question I thought was really interesting. Like you said something and you said, we can't escape the realities. And then, said something after that. That sentence sticks out because often our financial health, like the reason sometimes we struggle with it is because, or our financial stability even in regular times is because we don't like the reality, right? So we just sort of deny it, right? It's like, we're just like, oh, that's denial. That's what denial looks like, by the way. It's not, it doesn't come in with bells and whistles. It's just sort of there and you barely even notice that it's happening. There is I can't even begin, even as somebody who as a hobby loves behavioral economics, I can't even begin to wrap my head around how this will look in terms of the larger economy when we move forward to whatever the next phase looks like. I'm talking a year and a half from now, when we have more certainty around how we're going to get our arms around this virus.
So I think that, certainty, I think, is virtually non-existent. But as you were saying that, we're talking about denial, and I couldn't help but think, of this book that I was reading called Bright-Sided, about how, the relentless promotion of positive thinking is undermining America. And I think the world that we play in particular, right? The sort of life coaches and personal development work, and I mean, hell, even some of my own content, I think is guilty of this, is perpetuating delusional optimism.
This is such a good topic. Oh, this is why you're so good.
I guess, really, I think, how do you make the transition from, what is basically delusional optimism to a rational level of optimism?
Yeah. Okay, so I am proud to say that I have never been accused of hope and optimism ever, although I have much of it, And I'm also proud to say that I've been skeptical of the positive thinking movement. And when I say that, because I really want to be clear about this, I love gratitude. I am filled to the brim with it. I think it's an important tool for people to use in a much larger arsenal of coping skills. I think thinking positively and seeing where opportunity lies is a really, really important mental practice in the game of greatness. And that's not synonymous with accomplishment and success, just being a great human. Let's be aspirational, people. What I have a problem with is when the positive movement sort of this emphasis on positivity starts to limit and stunt people's ability to sit in the reality that sometimes things suck. And that too is a mental practice. The ability to actually just be in the reality of what you feel and build the emotional agility to tolerate discomfort. And what I see inside myself, the times in my life where I have struggled the most, is because I'm trying to hang on to a reality that is no longer congruent with what is unfolding in my life. And when we can't pivot with that, we get into all kinds of defensive maneuvers. These are usually unconscious. The way you're describing it is awesome. I'm actually going to take it. I'm going to footnote you, but I'm going to take it. From delusional optimism to rational optimism. In psychology, we call it magical thinking. And it's a type of defense mechanism developmentally that develops very early, and it can persist all through life. And but it's a regressive style. It is by nature, if you can't sit and tolerate the truth and the complexity, like when we were talking about families, right? Just the complexity of our world right now. And the pandemic is really merely one narrative at this point. And if you can't do that, you're never really going to be able to show up to the moment. And my hope is to move the needle, right? When I take my last breath, I just want to know that in every domain of my life, I swung for the fences and I left every encounter slightly better than it was before I participated in that moment in time. That's with my kid, my siblings, my friends, you, this moment that we're on this podcast. But we got to show up in reality together. So it's really important. It's a conversation. It's really, when people hear this conversation, I hope that they see what you're really saying is like, how is it that we can start to be in the reality of where our world is without making it rosy and also not making it doomed. Right?
Yeah.
That's tough. I've been practicing for 45 years. And so have you. And I agree with you completely. There is, we in this field, those of us participating in helping people self-actualize, or giving them the tools to self-actualize themselves. We got to be better at really just encouraging people to embrace the suck.
It's funny because as I was hearing you say that, I remember talking to one of my really good friends who's like a mentor, and who one of the reasons I moved to Boulder, and we're talking about sort of why he had somehow stuck to Unmistakable Creative and all of this, and he said basically what you're providing is a skeptic's guide to a good life. I was like, oh yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. I said that sounds like an interesting
book title, maybe.
Post. Yeah, that literally was what I thought of as a skeptic's guide to living a good life. So
I see it now on the New York Times bestsellers list. I'm visualizing that for you.
All right. Well, just as an FYI, I've literally had my agent turn down every book proposal and outline I've sent her in the last 9 months. I'm at the point where I
turn this one down.
Well, let me just retitle it and be like, hey, this is what I think the title should be. We'll see. Yes. But I don't know. I've almost gotten to the point where it's like, you know what? I'm not going to. That's a whole other story. I don't want to get into that. But the other thing I think that comes from all of this, and this is even for me personally, I think you've talked about accepting and sort of living in the reality that we're in the moment. And having the emotional agility to adapt to it, but so much of our worry is not about the moment, but about the future, and this sort of unwritten future where we don't know what's going to happen.
That's why you can't be in the moment.
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you, like, I have anxiety over this. I was like, oh, this is going to be the year that I finally have enough money to settle down, get in a relationship, start a family, and suddenly that all kind of became an afterthought. And, we're like, wow, is that going to happen? So
Interesting.
How do you and that's my version of it. I'm sure everybody has their own version of this.
Right. Yeah, and your version, of course, because you can't take the shrink out of me ever, much to my husband's chagrin and probably my kids' chagrin too.
Yeah.
I would challenge you if we were partnered in collaboration to really look at the tenets on which you built the moving forward with a relationship and family. It's an interesting combo there, and we'd have to get under that hood a little bit more. But okay, so ask me the specific question that's more generalized.
Yeah, I think that many of us have this profound anxiety about the future. And we were talking about money, and I think money is a perfect place to segue from that. I can tell you, like the fears that have gone through my head are: what if I run out? What if I have to move back home again? Like I think everybody has some version of what if I end up on the streets? Like these are, I can't imagine. And I know that, I am like totally in a place of privilege to be in the situation that I'm in, to have the family that I do, to have been educated the way that I have, and to be socialized the way that I have. Like my life is one of privilege without question. And that is something I've come to realize from the people that I've talked to on this show. And yet there is this profound anxiety of the worst that could happen.
Yes, because you are human and you are you're allowed to have that, right? They don't cancel each other out. Privilege doesn't mean that you don't also suffer from the human condition. There's a ton here, and I'm going to try to keep my thoughts somewhat lucid for you. It makes me think about I lived through the stock market crash in the 80s, right? And I remember I can't remember if I had this conversation with my dad because I was young, or if it's a screen memory. And I remember him telling one of my older siblings or a work colleague, but in my mind's eye, he said this to me, that basically, he had tremendous anxiety and stuff, but that essentially, he said to me, when everybody is running in one direction, turn around. And that was sort of all he said, essentially saying, turn around and you're going to see opportunity. So one of the things that I work with the in my consulting business is that capacity as a metaphor to take the anxiety. It's informative and instructive. We don't always have to silence it. Again, that moves into trying to repress things instead of leaning in with an ear pressed to get the message. There's lessons here. And so that metaphor of sort of let the anxiety inform you, and there is a sweet spot. That is practicable. Being in that sweet spot, and then turn around. There's tons, literally physically change the perspective you're looking at this landscape. And for all of us, I think we're going to find that there's real places of opportunity. So for people like you and me, opportunity comes as places to be of service. We like to be of service. You also seem to love, you have a nature about you that has you're comfortable being provocative in a way, and actually you pull it off with a ton of charm. You really do.
Well, wait till people hear the interview with the porn star a couple of weeks from now. They might change their mind about that.
I love that. I hope that's true.
It is true.
Oh my God, I love that. I love that. And because it's only society that says that the porn star should not have a voice. Absolutely, he or she should have any voice and platform. We still live in America, right? So I love that. I will tune into that specifically. But yeah, so, turn around, there's opportunity, and the anxiety is informative. There's lots of tools and tactics and behavioral things, most of which are free and renewable and inside of us. Start with your breath, get sunrise and sunset light, meditate. This is not rocket science, right? For the sort of low-hanging fruit of self-regulation to get into that sweet spot where anxiety is a steer and a guide. It will be what distinguishes you at the end. Yeah, look, there is uncertainty. You don't know what your company, your organization will look like at the end of this, but it'll be somewhere. And so that's sort of my kind of how I approach it, even myself. And I'm throwing on top of that, I'm throwing on top of everything else. I'm moving in 3 weeks from Hawaii back to my home city of Boston. So there's just just so much that I can't possibly even speculate on. And but that's the philosophy I'm going to take.
Wow. A new moment in wireless has begun. T-Mobile and Sprint are joining forces. Bringing together our two networks, T-Mobile will build America's largest and most reliable 5G network. With more towers, more engineers, more bandwidth, and more coverage, you'll not only get the best 5G network in America, you'll also get the best prices. Welcome to T-Mobile.
Nice to meet you.
So a lot of people ask me which podcasts I recommend, and one of those is the Jordan Harbinger Show. Recently, he had an episode with Kobe Bryant, and since he's a good friend, I've actually got Jordan right here now to tell us a little bit more about that.
Kobe Bryant's a fascinating guy, or was a fascinating guy, I should say. I didn't want to ask him things about basketball because it just seemed like an opportunity to ask him things that had nothing to do with basketball for once. And Kobe was an interested parent, but also very, very creative. We talked a lot, in fact, mostly about the children's book that he had published, how it was designed, how he stays in the mind of a designer, how he hires people and manages. And it's definitely not the same thing we saw on the basketball court. And I got him to admit that he loves Taylor Swift. So that was kind of funny as well.
Of course, you can find that episode linked in the show notes, and you can find the Jordan Harbinger Show anywhere you get your podcasts.
Oh, so there's one component of this that is kind of a tangent, but I figure who better to talk to about talk with about it than you. So my roommates and I were having this conversation about self-interest, and my roommate Tim said something that I actually turned into a blog post that I haven't published anywhere yet. He said any good society is driven by some level of self-interest. And I think that there is a grain of truth to that. But I think that as a society, the big caveat to that is what happens when you maximize it to the point of diminishing returns. And I actually thought this out. And I said, if you maximize power, if you maximize self-interest when it comes to power to the point of diminishing returns, you end up with authoritarianism. If you do it with money and status, you end up with inequality. And I think we're well past the point of diminishing returns as a society, because, you look around and you're like, this is insanity. In my lifetime, I've never seen anything like this. And we're close enough in age that I know that you haven't either.
Never.
So what do you have to say about that?
First of all, I can't wait to read that blog post. Please let me know when it gets published.
Okay.
You're 100% right. I usually stay sort of really apolitical in my public facing domain, and I sort of largely believe in that. But we really are kind of moving as a country in a way that feels very slippery to me, and I don't know kind of where that will shuffle out over time. And it feels slippery in that, we're a young country. We're like in our adolescence. And I just hope it's not hubris that we sort of are asleep at the wheel here, those of us in the voting population, thinking, oh, it won't happen to us. I want to sort of refresh people on what we talked about in this kind of last little tranche, right? Like 5 minutes ago, about magical thinking and denial, and how it's very insidious and it's not going to announce itself. And that is denial. If you think as a country that we couldn't and won't at some point in the long arc of being, quote, the United States, that we don't have the potential to take turns that would be, really drastically different than the democracy that we hold as an ideal. We have obviously never fully reached that. That is clear now as well. But it's an ideal and it's a brave experiment. I hope we keep doing it. It's so brave to truly try to have a space and aspire toward a space where you stay away from authoritarian sort of military style censorship and rule and more toward, everybody having a voice. And, I really want to find and want as a society for us to cultivate children that can become leaders to do that.
Wow. Well, let's shift gears and talk about what I think is another incredibly important aspect of navigating this time in our lives, and that is our social connections. Because, I think that I was really fortunate that I left California and happened to move in with two roommates who have become very good friends. I see them every day. And my sister even said, she said, if I would have been really worried about you if you'd been stuck in your apartment in San Diego, because all I had there was surfing and not people that I was seeing on a regular basis. Like, I know for a fact this would be 1,000 times worse if I wasn't seeing these guys every day. And it compensates for the fact that, like, we don't have intimate relationships at the same time. Like, we're, one of them is dating somebody and the two of us are single. We're single guys. Use your imagination. Like, we have a problem here. But, and I guess, the first piece is, navigating that aspect of this because, we know all the research shows that loneliness is incredibly toxic for us. Like, I figured out after coming to Boulder that I wasn't depressed in San Diego. I was lonely.
You were lonely.
Yeah.
You were disconnected.
Yeah. And yet people are being forced into disconnection right now. Many of them, like, I can't imagine having been a single person living in New York, over the last 3 months. How do we deal with this?
Yeah. There's so much here, like also just like the underlying theme of like male friendships, but I won't touch that. Okay. Disconnection is a killer. And loneliness, chronic loneliness can often sort of be just a hop, skip, and a jump away from hopelessness. And that is always a really, really sort of point of no return. So when I think about our kind of shared human conditions, right, we're all human. So I'm in the business of trying to understand the human experience and be witness to it and present in it with people. And I really just can't underestimate how much we are designed right down to our neurochemicals, oxytocin predominantly. It's actually a hormone, and we are wired to have it in our brain, in a brain that feels well. Oxytocin cycles in and out in a rhythm, just like dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, all the other neurochemicals. And that's where we see balance, right? So it really impacts us at a cellular level. This is how our relationships impact us epigenetically. This period of time is tough for that. The only strategy in the short run, first of all, is to remind yourself that it's a short run. In the long arc of a lucky life that gets to grow old in the sort of body that we borrow, right? Like in that equation, this will be a short stretch of time. So let's remind ourselves of that. And then you got to use tech. You got to reach out, and you got to find ways to connect. Also, meditation has been shown to be able to allow us to produce oxytocin on our own. I believe it's meditations that have the most sort of research around that. So there's a lot of tools and techniques to, write letters, go back to the old art of writing letters. And then the other thing that you can do is at this stage is if you're single, you can sort of maybe choose a friend that you now kind of together are going to see each other, but not really widen it past that, and that will be helpful. And also get outside, be around people, get outside and be amidst, in safe ways, connection.
I think that makes a perfect segue to where I want to finish. I mean, you talk about disconnection, which I think is the perfect sort of jump off point for talking about what we're seeing in terms of race relations in this country. And what I wonder is, what do you remember about race from when you grew up?
Great question. I remember knowing and feeling that I lived in a really privileged life. Right around sort of 8th grade, I became very, very aware of this. I lived in rarefied air. And yet the experience of being raised in restaurants, I had just, so many races, ethnicities, and cultures all around me from all levels that keep a single restaurant going. And my dad had like 50. So, that's sort of how I remember it. I just remember being aware but I did grow up in a very kind of white privileged space, and my parents were people of the 60s and the 70s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. So they had all their own sort of complexities to that, while they weren't like outwardly racist. So, my life has been a real lesson. I'm going to take the words of Rachel Cargle. It's been a lesson in sort of unlearning a lot of the unconscious things that I had, and of which I still have many, because I was raised in, a pretty myopic environment.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up bias. It was Desiree Adaway who, we aired her episode as part of our series this week, and she said everybody has unconscious biases.
Oh yeah,
and I wonder, particularly at this moment in history, with everything that's going on, how do people put those biases in check, and recognize them?
It's hard. I mean, it's the hardest
thing.
They're
unconscious.
One thing I'm really grateful for in terms of like conversation is just like the obviously I'm fast becoming like the girl that's obsessed with the unconscious, but starting to have a collective dialogue about how much of our interior world is actually unconscious to us, and biases are by design. They are clandestine by design. That's how they become biases. If you knew it was a bias, you'd be like, oh, there's that bias again, right? Most of us don't think the vast majority of us who are stepping on these landmines of biases all the time don't want to. We just are. And until you recognize that it's being mediated and governed by parts of your psyche that operate outside of your awareness and with profound immunity, until you recognize that, you have no fucking shot at catching them. It's why defensiveness, reflecting accountability, and blame are such deadly characteristics of any leader, not just the leader of a country, families, organizations, because they keep you in your bias loops. For me, it goes back to the unlearning. For me, it's the game of self-awareness. I am committed to being as self-aware as I can, warts and all, to show up and know that I am flawed and imperfect, but I'm here to try toward this sort of human ideal that we have. And, a lot of that is going to be, it's on me. It is on me. It's squarely on my shoulders to do the interior work of trying to understand the unconscious, first of all. And there's, you and I have talked at length, and you have so many podcasts on these practices. They're just practices. It's not magic, right? Meditation, mindfulness, therapy, coaching, spiritual reflection, right? I mean, this is what this is about. So there's lots of tactics and techniques. but you've got to be committed to the game of self-awareness. And if you're not, then, sort of beep, beep, move over, because I am. And I don't really want to be like caught up, like I've got to curate my experiences over the last few years as I've been more committed to having dialogue with people. I just really want to kind of work and talk and create stuff with people that want to play this game. And, it's that simple for me. And like everybody else, I'm sort of like, okay, that's just not my lane.
Wow. Well, I think that makes a really beautiful place to finish our conversation. So I want to finish with one last question, which I know you've heard me ask since I've asked you before. What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
The level at which you are able to show up and be vulnerable and amenable to growth. That's what I think it all comes down to.
Well, I think that makes fitting and poetic end to our conversation. I can't thank you enough for coming back for a second time and sharing your insight and your wisdom with our listeners.
Thank you for this. This conversation really ranks for me up there in, the top, tippity top.
Well, thank you for that. And for everybody listening, we will wrap the show with that. Did you know that every Sunday our community manager, Milena, sends out 10 key takeaways from episodes just like this one? All you have to do to receive it is sign up for our newsletter. Just visit unmistakablecreative.com/newsletter and you'll get them delivered right to your inbox. Again, that's unmistakablecreative.com/newsletter.